Okay, welcome everyone to this week's OMR architecture meeting. On this week's agenda, we have a couple of topics. The first is a presentation from Nazim on some of the work that he was doing while he was a student at the University of Alberta to integrate the OMR compiler in Julia. And I'll turn it over to him now to take you through that. Nazim?
Thank you, Daryl. So welcome to this brief presentation where I demonstrate being able to compile something from Julia using the OMR compiler that was facilitated with the help of the LLJB library. So just some quick recap of the LLJB project. It was initially designed to provide a mechanism for interoperability between LLVM and JITbuilder. And one of the primary goals was for languages that use LLVM backend to try using the OMR compiler with very minimal development effort. And recently, it was contributed to OMR, and now it lives as a subproject of JITbuilder. And I have provided the link here. So what we'll be looking at today is the Julia language. It was a starting point for me to try and experiment on how we can use LLJB in other languages. So Julia is a general purpose dynamic language that is mostly used in data science and machine learning applications. And it uses LLVM backend for just out-of-time compilation. And their approach is basically upon first invocation, methods are compiled. So to make sure that their code is as fast as possible, they assume that there would not be too many different methods being called all the time, which is why they claim to be very high performant. And one very cool feature of Julia is that it is easy to call, integrate with external C and Fortran libraries, and it doesn't require any glue code, and the overhead is quite minimal. So some of the primary goals of this mini project was to make some initial steps and realize one of the main purposes of LLJB in the real world, and kind of identify whether there are any major issues that a new language might face in trying to experiment with OMR compiler in their runtime. So in order for LLJB to be used, there are several steps. And first of all, it is basically obtaining the LLVM intermediate representation of a very simple Julia function to start with. So I spent quite a bit of time trying to intercept the LLVM IR that is passed to LLVM for compilation. However, that requires a lot of deep understanding of the Julia runtime. Its years of development has tightly coupled the two, and it's going to be quite a bit of effort to really intercept that. However, Julia does provide some tools that provide some sort of mechanism to extract the LLVM IR that will be generated by the Julia runtime. And we can easily intercept that and compile that using the OMR compiler instead. So this is how the Julia code will look like initially. So we just have a very basic function, and then we use the code LLVM function in the interactive utils module to generate the LLVM IR for this specific function. And this is how the output looks like. It's a very basic thing. It just, well, obviously we don't get the different basic steps here. It just returns the constant that we would get. Actually, there's an issue here. This IR is from a different version. It should be read I64.3, not 6. I just mixed it up with a different experiment I was playing around with. So the next step would be to pass the intermediate representation through LLJB. Like I mentioned before, Julia has a way to use external C libraries easily. You just have to provide the function name and the location of the library. In this case, we'll dynamically load the LLJB library and then provide the argument. I don't know if you can see. Okay. So the next step is to translate that into OMR IL and then compile and run it. So the thing is that in the initial implementation, LLJB expects the LLVM IR modules to be something that was previously generated by a front end, and they're consumed as bitcode files on disk. Which is why I needed to introduce an API where I could consume C string that is that represents the module and convert that into an LLVM module to consume later on. Okay, here is how I just declare that as an external C function that can be called from Julia. And I take that LLVM IR and then construct a module and compile, get the code entry, and then return the result from running that. And the next step, so we get to print the output value from this. And so here is the result of the execution that we have right here. So that's it. It was very simple. And in terms of challenges, I guess the biggest challenge was trying to understand the internals of Julia runtime. What this proof of concept shows that it is possible to easily try the OMR compiler in languages that currently use the LLVM backend, although the example I showed here doesn't have much advanced IR that is being generated. I have tried more complex functions and I was able to successfully run them. And I think it is possible to make some initial assessments of the impact that OMR compiler is going to have on your runtime. You could measure the slowdown in startup as a result of the addition of OMR. Well, although we're not able to totally remove the LLVM backend and just kind of assess the impact of just having OMR compiler instead of LLVM. But it just gives you an idea of how much impact this compiler alone has, or how much additional memory footprint it's caused by the OMR compiler and so on. And so that's basically all I wanted to talk about today. And if you have any questions about this little project, I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks, Steve. Notice on slide 5 that the LLVM input already went through a bunch of optimization stages in the LLVM itself.
Those optimizations actually happen, are done by the Julia runtime, and unfortunately, I could not find any way to disable that.
I see. Okay, so the
LLVM does not do any optimizations on this piece of the code.
Okay, thanks.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, so what is the difference of this approach between compiling, let's say, with just JIT builder means and generating OMR IL. There's, do I understand it correctly that it's just LLVM intermediary representation is later converted into OMR representation and later compiled by OMR JIT-Builder backend by Testarossa. Okay.
Yes, basically, it's not supposed to be something you use as like you ship with your product. It just LLGB is meant to be used as something to assess the benefit of using the OMR compiler and just to play around with minimal effort. And then you can decide if you want to invest more time into really constructing OMR compiler IL directly, in which case you would get much better results.
I see. Thank you. And what is the, like, how, I'm sorry, maybe it's a methodology question, but how would be the, that benefit that you just said assessed? Like, previously you were mentioning that what people can estimate is the overhead added by OMR compiler. So how can you, like, what's the methodology you would suggest for separating the benefits from OMR compiler and benefits from using like LLVM code? Like, how would you separate the benefits for estimating it?
So basically, if I was a Julia developer, I would have a much better understanding of how I can separate the dependency on LLVM itself. So right now, me not having any experience in Julia, it's going to be a significant amount of work for me to figure it out and find a way I can separate this out. But as for someone in the Julia development community who has a lot of experience, could maybe easily prevent even loading the LLVM library, because it's not really required until you need to pass it for optimizations and compilation. So maybe disable that at that stage and then just instead provide the intermediate representation to the OMR compiler instead. So in that way, you can measure much better. At this time, with like the scope of this mini project, it was way too much to kind of try to totally separate out LLVM on my own. So right now I can just talk about the additional time that is added as a result of having this extra OMR compiler library loaded and used.
I see. So I see what you are saying. And the last question that I have, so I am interested in working on OMR compiler, and I needed a runtime environment to try out something more with dynamic, a runtime environment that supports a language with dynamic features. So if I were to repeat the path you have taken and having what you have contributed to OMR, how long would it take to recreate to something that is like behaves the way to reproduce your results in terms of commitment? Like, can you give an estimate? Like, would it take months or years, or is it relatively simple to set up? Just to reproduce what you have done approximately, to have a runtime that would be able to run Julia code using OMR as a backend.
Well, that depends. Are you talking about my so what I presented here, or really just decoupling LLVM from Julia and replacing that with, let's say, just LLGB?
I think to replicate what you have just presented.
No, that shouldn't. Once you understand, once like I understood the Julia runtime, it was not really much effort to do this. I just had to implement this API to accept the intermediate representation from Julia. And this is basically just teaching, like basically setting up LLJB to consume that past intermediate representation. And other than that, there is no other changes that I really needed in LLJB's code or in Julia's internals.
I see. So thank you very much.
Nadeem, can you talk a little bit about some of the more elaborate methods that you've, or more complicated methods that you've looked at? What kinds of experiences have you had there? Anything not like, did anything just not work when you were playing around?
So one thing that I had issues with is when it came to allocating or dynamic allocations, because I still don't fully understand how the GC is how the GC implementation is. So basically, every load and store actually happens with call to a Julia intrinsic function where you load specific values. So that was a roadblock which I did not really invest much time on pursuing. But other than that, I was able to generate LLVM IR for most of the currently supported intermediate representation in LLJB. So I was able to make more complicated functions and more complicated Julia functions that generated things like P nodes and also like conditional blocks and so on.
Cool. Thanks.
I was going to ask if there was anything that you would be able to contribute for this, and it sounds like the body of that one method is it. So,
yeah, in terms of contribution, so one thing I could take from this is that we could provide some APIs, different APIs that would allow using LLJB as a third-party library for any language to basically pass in what it needs to compile, and it can be easily just compiled and run, and the result obtained for different scenarios. Right now, we don't really have that, and that's what I had to add as part of that shared library.
Okay, I was thinking more about what you actually did. So, for example, if Georgi wants to pick up your work and perhaps extend it or carry on in some way, could he use what you have done as a starting point?
To achieve this, there isn't really much of a change to make in Julia itself, because like I said, I haven't made changes in the internals of Julia to separate out the tying in with LLVM. So if you want to start working on that, I guess the first step would be to somehow isolate all the points where we could separate out LLVM from Julia. Like if you wanted to make direct changes in the Julia code base itself. Yeah, so I do have a few test cases written in Julia, and I just made them part of the Julia's test cases. The test suite that Julia provides, just added a few tests to that. So that allows you to easily execute these tests rather than having to manually enter those in command line. It's a little complicated to run it. Like that's what I found initially.
Okay, thanks. Any more questions for Nazim?
Guess I could ask the obvious. So what's next?
What next? It depends on what the OMR community would feel about how we can take this, like whether it's worth investing some more time in just replacing LLVM in Julia, or whether we just work on making the LLJB more consumable by maybe adding features to have like adding more capability in terms of handling of the LLVM IR that is related to vector operations, for example. But and also adding more API to it. So yeah, and right now I'm leaning more towards making LLJB more accessible and capable of handling different intermediate representations.
I guess the other interesting piece of it that you mentioned is the interaction with the GC. That
Yes.
an area where we've traditionally haven't made a whole lot of progress in integrating how the compiler component and how the GC component, or how the compiler component could integrate into another GC component. And we've had some research projects that have been looking at issues like that, but I think that'd be an interesting area to investigate too.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Nazim.
Yep.
All right.
Anything else for Nazim before we move on? Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Nazim.
Thanks, Ralph.
Let's see. Okay. Now for the part of the agenda that I think most people showed up for, which is so when we enabled the GitHub Actions a week or so ago, one of the consequences of that was that a number of it really highlighted a lot of the issues that we've had open for quite some time that we haven't really made any progress on. And some of us took a bit of a stab at going through relevant and if they were still interesting to the project, and thereby keeping them alive. But there are still some that haven't had any attention for quite some time. And I thought that for meetings like this, where we may have some time to discuss things after the regular part of the agenda, I thought that we could maybe start to go through some of those older ones just to decide whether or not they are still worth pursuing as an open issue. They should be closed, and maybe what the disposition of them should be. So I looked at ones that were so I picked a bunch here for today, and the ones that I picked were discussion, where they were labeled discussion issues. And the first four are kind of related to each other, all around documentation and that sort of thing. And then the fifth one being a release process and what we want to do with that one. So what I thought that we could do is to discuss, to talk through the various issues that I have here, to see whether or not this is something that that we want to continue to if it's still relevant. I'm not sure if me sharing them is going to help, or if everybody wants to sort of look at them on their own. I'll try to summarize the first one here, 800. So what this one was I guess a discussion initiated by Mark, I believe, for I should actually bring it up rather than me doing it off the top of my head. But it was a discussion around where we should be placing Doxygen comments in headers. I don't believe that this was a sort of a JIT specific or a compiler specific issue. It was maybe more of a generic thing about where should we be putting Doxygen comments. I think that there's some differences of opinion as to whether or not they should live in header files where the API is actually defined, or whether or not they should live in C++ files where they might be providing less, where there may be less clutter. So find this thing. Sorry, I'm a bit Right. So I guess I'll stop there and then turn it over to if this has any comments that they want to make on this. Oh, Mark commented 40 minutes ago. Huh.
It's the benefit of having it listed in an agenda for a meeting.
Oh.
Called my attention to it. Yeah, I mean, I think the bulk of this issue was kind of whether or not we should be asking for Doxygen comments to be placed in headers for APIs. That's to define public APIs. I think that's basically what it boils down to. The coding standard already sort of describes that we should be documenting public API in headers at the point where the functions are declared. So that's really just kind of the Doxygen flavor to it. I think it originated from a conversation with Philip.
Okay, I think that's how things are going in practice. At least for the compiler component, I think that's how things have been going for the last few years. In that, for new APIs or for APIs that change, I think we've been pretty good at insisting that Doxygen comments come along with it, and I think they've pretty much exclusively been added to the header files. What I have seen is that if there's longer, more detailed descriptions about things, they sometimes get added to the C++ header in the C++ file, so that it doesn't clutter. But the API itself is documented in the header file. So I don't know if anything really needs to change here, because if it's already documented in this coding standard, then perhaps we don't have anything to change here. The one thing would be, though, is that coding standard isn't necessarily universally applicable through all areas of the code. And it's hard to decide what to pick and choose from that coding standard that applies to different parts of the code. But that's maybe a topic for another discussion at another time.
Well, I guess one question is I see Robert and Andrew are on the call, who primarily work in GC and VM components. I guess is the same policy kind of being held up there? The Doxygen comments on public APIs, or?
So we're definitely documenting public APIs with Doxygen style comments.
Okay.
The GC in general is documented in headers, but for the other VM components like the port library, I think that it's more common to see the Doxygen comments in the source files.
Right. Okay.
That's
probably been there for 15 years or something, though.
Yeah.
It's just another aspect of the aspirational nature of our coding standard. Aspirational, but not necessarily timely. Right. So to me, it doesn't sound like there's very much to do here then, since we're already kind of by de facto doing this. So maybe I'll just close the issue with that kind of comment, unless someone disagrees strongly.
That makes sense. I'm okay with closing the issue. Just a couple of thoughts that came to mind. Maybe just to kind of enforce for future work that people do when we make sure we add Doxygen comments would be to actually start generating Doxygen pages again. I don't know if we could have a GitHub action doing this and publishing it somewhere, but it seems like that could be a useful thing to have.
Yeah.
Overwhelming support. Yes, it does sound like a good idea.
I was just trying to think through how it would actually get done. I mean, I imagine we could get something, and where we would put it too.
Right.
I could presumably go into another repo at GitHub that we would automatically create or automatically populate.
Yeah, there's a few ways you could implement this. Maybe that's better discussed in a different issue, but
yeah, I was going to actually suggest that you create an issue for the document for adding Doxygen or for running for creating the Doxygen documentation separately.
Agreed.
If we don't already have one, and that does sound like a very familiar topic.
Yeah, I guess the other thing then is maybe at some point we should try to make a decision about which Doxygen syntax we want to use.
Okay. I think that would probably best come with a proposal.
Sure.
I think in general, what I see most commonly is that we're using the @ sign, and we're using the C style comments with the double star at the top. That's the kind of style that you mean, right?
Yeah, I think in the compiler component, at least across OMR and OpenJ9 and other projects that extend OMR, I think the split is actually about 50-50 usage of @ versus \.
Yeah, I've seen both quite a bit actually. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there could be an attempt to standardize that, yes, but I think, like I said, I think it would. A proposal would be good, but I also think that if we're ever going to make any progress at some point on a standardized coding convention, that it should probably be part of that effort.
Yeah, okay.
Which you'll notice I didn't actually include in this list today, but a topic for another time.
Yeah, well, and I guess the other point is, right, that at least getting some documentation, even if it's not consistent in the @ and the / or whatever, if we need to go and standardize it at some point with a script, it's really not going to be as hard if the conventions are generally being adhered to with just a few minor syntax variations, right?
Yeah.
And I'd much rather encourage people to put docs in than being too pedantic about how the docs look, at least at this point, and we can try and fix them later if we have to.
The output of those Doxygen tools is the same regardless.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so I guess the disposition on this issue 800 is to close it. Leo will probably open a new issue for automatically generating or regularly generating the Doxygen artifacts. Then we got to figure out what to do with them, which is maybe starting to lead into some of the other topics that we have. So the next one, I assume the discussion on that one is over. The next one is 1827, which was simply titled OMR Wiki, but it was really a request to start to use, to enable the wiki and the OMR project at GitHub, and to start populating it with information. There was a bit of a discussion back and forth about why a wiki over the web page, or over the website that we already have. My opinion on this, I do want to keep. I don't want to have too many places to go to look for information. That's sort of my opinion. I like to keep information close to the code as much as possible. So be it in a MD format file somewhere in the code, or actually commented in the code, I'm sort of in favor of that. For the actual wiki itself, I'm not. I guess I'd like to understand what kinds of information would go in there that we wouldn't put into the code, what kinds of design information or whatever. So the originator, I don't think, is on the call, so I don't think we can involve him in the discussion at this point, but others want to chime in here with any input.
I think part of the concern was around having things in, it's all well and good to have MD files and documenting things close to code, but when you have things like process documents and sort of diagnostic documentation on how to do things, that sort of stuff doesn't really need to be stored in the Git repo, and everyone will have to clone it all the time, which maybe it's not a big deal until we have tons of it. But you kind of sneak up on that problem, and then there's no way to fix it really. So I think the idea was, I think, that the wiki might be something easier to work with, but as I think Matthew pointed out in the original item, the wiki would probably still be kind of controlled by, or would only be writable by, the committers of the project anyway. And I think Matthew was looking for a place where he could document some of the work that he was doing on the side and just kind of make it accessible, document, where we are on certain things. I'm not quite clear why issues weren't the right way to do that, but it might just have an imperfect understanding of what it was that Matthew wanted to do originally.
Yeah, just reviewing this, it seems to be more like, he says project plans and status updates and that kind of thing. Maybe it would be more appropriate for wiki. The other thing about wikis that and maybe somebody can correct me if I am using them incorrectly, in that you almost need to know what you want to find, as opposed to being able to sort of browse through a wiki, right? So you have to search for a particular page that you're looking for, as opposed to sort of seeing everything that's there and navigating it that way.
Well, I think that just depends on how the wiki is organized and like what search functionality it has, and if it has automatic aggregation or something like that.
And also, as a user of OMR who started relatively recently, like an argument towards wiki is that in wiki you can like make the links between the pages way easier than you would be like you would be doing in the comments to the source files. For example, if you wanted to do something with a source file, you basically don't simply know where to look at. Like, comments don't link to other source files usually, while in wiki it's easier to do, right? But that will help simplifying, like, beginning of using OMR once you are more comfortable with it. Once I got more comfortable with it, it became not an issue, and I kind of got used to idea of looking for comments in the code.
What I found other projects doing is having the actual wiki content in the markdown files checked into the repository, and the wiki kind of a summary of everything.
Yeah, so that might be a way that we could approach it, right? The wiki could be a way of organizing the material that's in the repo, because I mean the wiki is also not, I don't think anyway, it's not really version controlled. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, it is not.
Would the wiki then just be a sort of a collection to the links to the MD files that are in the repo?
Yeah, that's right.
An entry point to the information which is in the repo, I guess.
So one other thing that we could do is take our docs directory and structure it so that it's more like a wiki. So we could put like an index.md or something in the root of the documentation directory, and the people can look through that to find the links to the subdocuments. So we could do the same sort of thing in the docs folder. I thought that the wiki was version controlled. I thought it was just a branch or something off the main repo.
Interesting. Okay.
It is its own repository. You can actually clone it. Yeah, so OMR and then .wiki, that'll clone the wiki repository, and you can see the version history, but it's not the same as the regular repository.
Are people able to, I don't know if you know this, but are people able to open PRs against the wiki, or would the only way to edit it be to go through the web UI?
It's actually, you have to directly edit it in the browser itself, or you can make edits and then push your changes.
Okay. And do we know
for PR process?
Okay, and do we know for sure that only committers can actually edit the wiki, or can we somehow open up access to more people?
I'd kind of like to believe that only committers have access to it in a way.
But it just seems like if there's I can understand that we want to gate editing based off of like committer approval, but if we go with the wiki, there isn't even a process for external contributions.
Yeah. I have a feeling this is going to get, at some level, it'll get dictated by how the Eclipse Foundation set up the organization somehow. But I don't know that for a fact. I was just kind of trying to figure out how that would work while we were talking, but I haven't been able to dig into enough detail yet. I guess the first ultimate question is, do we need a wiki? Is the wiki something that's going to help us do something that we're not doing right now because it's too hard for, documentation isn't exactly one of our strengths, I wouldn't say. Although we've done a lot better at this over the last couple of years, but I guess I'm also worried about creating yet another entry point that sort of doesn't really get curated and maintained, just because it's another thing we would have to curate and maintain.
Is this, I mean, are wikis used, are they one of the primary entry points for other projects? Does anybody know? I mean, we don't want OMR to necessarily be remiss because...
I don't think there's, like, there isn't a standard way of going about this. Some projects use wikis, some projects use websites, some projects use blogs. Like, there's not really a standard approach to this.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of like Rob's suggestion about reorganizing, if necessary, the doc directory that we have, and perhaps indexing it in some way. A fairly simple step forward that we could take to providing some organization to this. The other thing is, I don't think we have any artifacts at this point that discuss releases or discuss status or plans and that kind of thing. We tend to discuss those sorts of things on this call, which ends up creating some kind of an artifact in an issue that gets linked to the agenda page or something. So if we did have a wiki articles, I think they would be pretty sparsely populated.
Right, but could we just, wouldn't it make sense then for those kinds of things to post links to searches that produce the correct list of issues or whatever? Because I mean, our issues folder is a nightmare to navigate unless you really know what you're looking for, right? So if we had curated searches for the particular things that are of interest, right? Like, so these agendas or whatever, then it might make it easier for people to find the things that they need.
Yeah, perhaps.
Give an example of Roslyn, which is kind of a similar project to OMR, and how they structure their wikis. Kind of a global overview of the entire project. Just links to markdown documents inside the repo.
One other thing, sorry, I guess I am changing the subject, but we can get back to the Roslyn thing. But one other thing that we could do is use the docs folder to generate a website, because I know that GitHub Pages can generate like a website for OMR based on the contents of the docs folder. So if we did go down the route of checking everything into the Git repository under the docs folder, we could still compile it into a website.
Yeah, and we can use mkdocs for that. It's very simple to use that, and we can have some sort of a GitHub action to keep that up to date.
Yeah, or even just the built-in GitHub Pages if we wanted to do something more simply.
the reason I was suggesting MKDocs is that it provides, there are certain add-ons we can have that provides search functionality, and it's, I've used it and it's pretty fast and easy to search for materials.
Okay, so that's avoiding a wiki altogether then?
Yeah, I guess that would be building a website out of our documentation folder.
Yeah, we did always have on the Eclipse OMR website, we always had a link for documentation that I guess we had imagined would get filled in with that, or could even be a link to the MD files in the docs.
Yeah.
I guess I think, how many websites do we need?
Yeah.
Okay. So where do we get to on this? I think that there is some interest in exploring what we could do with a wiki, and perhaps just using that as a way of structuring the information that we already have checked into the repo, the documentation that we have in the repo, or providing queries to filter out the appropriate information within the repo. So I think maybe what we could do is to explore a bit about what capabilities there are and what kinds of permissions are needed to do what sort of actions, and can we only update this via the GUI? Can we update it by the programmatically? So I think exploring a few of those options with the wiki might be one of the next things to do here, as opposed to closing this out entirely. Any opinions from anyone else?
I think I would agree with that. I think I'd just like to make sure that we keep that conversation in the context of, what can the existing tools and mechanisms that we have, how much of the value of changing it can we get from our existing tools, with index files in MDs and sort of a set of curated links that help people find sets of issues that are of interest and that sort of thing.
So just for the record, it sounds to me like the conversation is very much flowing into what the next issue in the agenda is about.
Yep, you just stole my line. Would you like to introduce that, Leonardo?
I was not planning on it.
Okay.
But I just happened to be reading through it.
Okay, so for 1827, I think we're going to leave it open and just sort of summarize some of the discussion that we've had today on what some of the next steps are going to be there and what some of the possible uses of the wiki could be. That does lead us into, or it steers us in the direction of 352, which is one of the early issues that was created in the project around how do we want to structure the technical documentation. I need to bring this one up because is this the one that talked about read the docs? Is that this one?
Talks about read the docs, Doxygen. I think mentioned
Right.
GitHub pages somewhere in there.
I mean, without thinking about structure at this point, maybe this is getting back to a point that Andrew was making a little bit earlier about, I don't necessarily care about the structure of it at this point or how things are necessarily formatted, but I would like to get people to actually just start to write more documentation or create little artifacts here and there. Now, I think one of the points that's raised in this issue is that if we had a more friendly way of, or a more if the docs were structured in such a way, would it actually encourage people to write more documentation? Which seems to imply that the structure is what's inhibiting people from contributing. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, my opinion is I just like people to write documentation without necessarily thinking about how it should be structured at this point. But that's where this issue comes in. I would hate to over-architect something or bring in other solutions that we don't necessarily need. But
I think our current way of just writing markdown documents is probably the best for now. I mean, those are just plain text, and if we sometime down the road figure out this is not the right way to do things, we can easily transform them.
Yeah, in my mind, it's less about like how we write documentation and more about how the documentation is consumed. In my mind, that's like if we had the right tool, it would make it maybe easier to search for stuff, for example, because right now, if you wanted to search for a particular piece of information in the doc directory, for example, you'd have to like use grep or some tool like that. Whereas if you had published it somewhere that's more searchable, you could use some sort of built-in search function or even Google in theory to search for that information.
yeah, I'm not sure if we have enough documentation yet to explore that, but I know we are. We're certainly getting better.
You can also use GitHub search. I mean, I just searched for value propagation, which was the last thing I documented. You can just filter it by Markdown, and it shows all the docs that talk about it. It's the biggest issue. You can also search wikis. There's a filter there as well.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think, I mean, this is just my opinion, but I think it's a bit premature to be looking at some of these other tools when I think we need to start building up more of the content. So I'm not sure.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's
worth people to write the documentation. I think organizing the documentation is kind of is a nice problem to have, because that means we have an abundance of it.
Yeah. So I would propose closing this one then. With the, with the opinion that we're going to go with Markdown files at the moment, but we could certainly revisit this in the future if we ever had trouble managing or navigating the documentation that we have.
I have a simple question, Daryl. So again, from a perspective of just a mere user, is there a documentation that says what is requirement to new documentation? Say, if a person was to contribute a feature, I've read somewhere that there is Doxygen requirement.
Yes, I mean there is there's code documentation required, but in terms of actually producing, like, is there a format to the documentation that goes along with it, right? I don't think we have it specified in that level of detail, unless someone else knows of some documentation somewhere that I haven't seen.
Yeah, so
are you asking because you'd like to know, or are you thinking that we need to have that?
So I think it's one of the things that I will have to eventually do for my contribution to OMR, and it's just maybe having like 5 headers, like, for example, header like what is your feature and what the feature does, and how to use the feature, just a description of requirement of documenting new feature besides the comments to the class itself. Maybe this could be a useful thing. I mean, I can figure that internally.
I don't know if that's a little too prescriptive, though, right? Some of the things, there are a lot of very different things that land in OMR, right? So trying to have a template for it is a bit difficult, right? Like it tends to, some of the documentation has tended to be, right, so can you summarize the design in a markdown file, and we leave that open-ended so that people can kind of write whatever design they think, and then it's kind of a discussion with the committers or whatever to make sure that the right things get in there.
Yeah. I tend to agree. I think, and maybe going back to yes, we want to have a little bit of structure around what it is that they're trying to say, but on the other hand, I want to encourage them to say whatever they want to say, right? I mean, we want to get people to write stuff. So I don't think we want to be telling them like, thanks, but you should actually write it this way instead. Lower the barrier.
Fair. That's fair. Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to close through 52 then. The next one, hosting for presentation artifacts. This has actually come up recently. I think it was Andrew Young that brought this up. So bring this one up just so that I make sure I know what I'm talking about. This is the one to understand where we want to put things like presentations and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, that's what the issue was. So what I was noticing was every time we put up our material anywhere, it eventually goes missing, and our links on our front page README have been perpetually dead. And I've updated them several times because I think that it's one of the first things that people will go and look at when they're introduced to our project. So I think it's pretty important to keep those links alive. I think right now what we've been using IBM Box accounts to host a lot of the presentation materials, and those have gone missing when people leave IBM. Mm-hmm. So what I wasn't really saying, like giving any specific suggestions. I was just saying that what we have right now is not exactly working.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think there must be another issue where we talked about this before, but I think that in terms of size, the largest artifacts that we have tend to be these calls, and they're all hosted at YouTube, so we don't really have to worry about something that can handle files of these size. They tend to be like maybe 50 to 100 megabytes, depending on the length of the call. But for things like presentations and documents and other things like that, that is something that we could perhaps even just store in GitHub, because they may not be as large as. And the advantage of GitHub is that it's just it isn't necessarily going away anytime soon, and it's keeping it a little bit closer to where the code actually is. The drawback being that you may not want to clone all that stuff every time if it lives in the same repo. So maybe we need a separate repo just for those kinds of artifacts.
Couldn't the website repo be used for that purpose, since people are naturally downloading that, cloning it all the time?
The Eclipse OMR website repo, right?
Yeah. Right. That one.
As opposed to the other website.
Yes, as opposed to the other website. Because how many websites do we need? Never mind. I didn't ask the question.
Yeah. So that website, the Eclipse website repo would be a place to put that. I think I created an issue there, didn't I, to talk about this?
I think there's an issue there as well.
This seems familiar.
I've either seen it there or at OpenJ9. So
Oh,
the
okay.
the other advantage of it being managed via GitHub is that you have to do a pull request and make a commit, and the commit will have the ECA attached to it. So it's basically the materials are being contributed under the same license and therefore are accessible under the same rights that you have access to everything else in the that people have rights to everything else in the community. So I think that makes sense, right? You don't want individuals managing all of these things individually. It would be better if it's attached to the project, and then also the Git repos are actually backed up by Eclipse just in case anything ever happens to them.
What is the website repo?
GitHub.com Eclipse/Omar-website, I believe.
That page doesn't exist.
Or maybe .website.
Yeah, it's something like that, or a hyphen or something like that.
Yeah, it's dot.
It's .website, okay.
The only problem is that there's a manual step that's involved in having content that's updated on that GitHub repo becoming part of the actual OMR website that shows up on the Eclipse page.
What is that step? Do you know?
Good question. I was wondering that recently myself. I think Charlie is the only one who knows it. I don't know if he.
I may have it, or it may have expired on me, but like it may have fallen off the end of the conveyor belt. But it used to be
Charlie for it too.
Yeah, it used to be a job that you had to run, I believe, within IBM, that would poke the various things on Jekyll.
Well, I didn't think it was on IBM. I thought it was on our CI.
Oh, is that where it is now?
It's on the OMR CI, I thought.
Okay, I think it has the word website in it, if I remember correctly. So we can't have that many CI jobs that.
Oh, ye of so much.
Sync OMR website from GitHub to Eclipse. Couldn't be any more descriptive than that.
Yeah, that can't be it.
Okay, that's probably
a year and 7 months ago.
Yeah.
Well, it failed a year ago.
It's supposed to run. I think in theory it's supposed to run automatically, but it never did, if I remember correctly.
The last 2 times it's ran, it's failed. It's encouraging.
But the bigger thing, though, is to answer the question here about where to host presentation artifacts and things like that. It would sound as if the OMR website repo is where it should be. Now, what the structure of that information is perhaps another question. But linking it. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I wonder if Eclipse allows us to use any of the Git LFS. There's a Git LFS server that we could use for. I think that came up in one of the issues somewhere too, as an option.
Yeah, we may not even be close to the size, though, to even needing it yet.
Yeah, that's
true. If we have that much information yet. If we stored these recordings there, we probably would need it. But
probably let's just not complicate things and use the OMR website for now.
Yeah, that would be a good start. Especially if things are small. Yeah, it looks like there's some permission denied things happening in these runs that are failing. Not sure what that's all about. I know that part of what this job has to do is it has to take the content that's in the website in the omr.website repo and move it into an Eclipse repo and then run the Jekyll run Jekyll there to generate the website. I believe that's the sort of basic flow. So it may just not be able to. I don't know. There might be something off in the sync.
Okay, so that
very useful observation. I know
needs to get. Okay. Okay, so I think the disposition for 50/50 here is to use the OMR website repo. And there's some work needs to be done in order to make that work again. Anybody have any dissenting opinion on that? Okay. Done.
I do just want to say one thing about our website. I think it would be really great if we rendered our docs directory and included a copy of that in the website somehow, so that our docs actually showed up on the website. Because I know the website has some like instructions for building that are totally out of date and things like that. And it would be great if we just had one place to write documentation. That's all.
Presumably, if we were to produce Doxygen, it would be linked. Like if we produce the HTML artifacts from Doxygen, they would be linked to on the website as well, right?
Yeah, that would make sense to me.
That's how we would present it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I just think about the build instructions, especially because we have multiple copies of it sort of everywhere. And I think every single one of them is out of date to a different degree. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay, and that brings us to the 2274, which is the release process. So we did our first release last summer. Is there any, and this issue was created to talk through the parameters of how we wanted to how we wanted to do those releases and the frequencies and that sort of thing. Is there anything more that needs to be discussed in this particular issue as we go forward, or has it already served its purpose, do you think?
I thought the discussion had basically shut down in this. Like we'd kind of settled on what it was we were going to do. We didn't end up doing that, but we had kind of settled on how we were going to apply the release process. And we had decided, as I remember, we had decided on kind of a 6-month cadence, something like that, time-based rather than content-based. We did the 0.1.0 release in, I thought it was like October or something like that. Just to kind of get a foot in the sand. Yeah, I think it was October that we actually did that release. But we haven't really wasn't very much feedback that was a useful thing from the OMR community, and I don't think any of the consumers really. I don't think it really made a difference to any of the consumers that we created a release. It would be a good way for us to document what's happening in the project, and I still kind of agree with that. But I guess anyway didn't get on the task of actually documenting what was happening over the course of the 6 months that happened since the first release was out to be able to do a second release, and nobody was shouting to do it, so it kind of fell by the wayside, unfortunately.
Right. Okay. So you're talking more about just sort of perpetuating the release process, which is fine and maybe a discussion that we could have. But in terms of actually the initial proposal that was opened here and that we discussed and that we actually implemented, I guess maybe the one action of that would be to just sort of conclude that by just documenting what it is that we had agreed upon and then closing that off. Hey, we can add it as a page in the wiki, and then we can close it off. And if we do want to create releases going forward, like we proposed, then perhaps new issues at that time would be warranted.
Did we end up creating? I'm trying to, because there isn't actually very much information in there about our first release. I'm kind of wondering if we created an actual. Yeah, there was a release 0.1.0 planning. There we go.
It's on, where is it, under GitHub somewhere?
Yeah, there's
And,
issue 4338.
Hmm.
It's the release 0.1.0 planning, which we even managed to close. In fact, I assigned it to myself to close it, apparently. And I was right. October 4th was the release date. So, but I think you're right. I think documenting the basic findings. There's a discussion around this. I think we had at one of the architecture meetings that I'm not sure got.
Yeah, I think it's linked in.
Looking.
Well, it says fudge. Where is it here? It's at the bottom of 2274. I saw the link there. I can find that again. The June 4th OMR architecture meeting. That's when we discussed it.
Yeah, good point.
Oh, hang on, that's today. Dope.
Yeah, that's good.
I was going to say, Daryl.
Yeah, hang on here. There, I saw it somewhere. It's yes, we did talk about it. I'm pretty sure it's. Go back to the actual page itself and OMR releases. We talked about it on September 26th. We talked about it on October 24th, 2019. So we have done.
Yeah, that would have been
some
after we
discussion.
did the first release. That makes sense. All right. So then I guess linking to that issue in this one would be useful since there was follow-on. Was there a follow-on issue? Follow-on. Is there any documentation of what we talked about in that meeting other than the recording?
I don't believe so. I do seem to remember that one of those release meetings, I thought you took notes about what we were discussing about the releases.
Sort of sounds like something I do. Okay. I can go and try. Anyway, I don't think that's relevant to what we do with this one. I think we find whatever follow-on information we have. We put a link here just so that it's there, and then we can probably close this one.
Yeah.
I think we actually did what we set out to do in this particular issue.
Yeah.
Does that sound reasonable to everyone?
Yep.
Good, just to me.
Then I can go away and make myself sad about my follow-on activities from here.
Okay, so all right, so it sounds like we'll close 4 of these issues and keep 1827 open, and then we'll get a new issue from Leo. So net -3. All right. Okay, that's all I had on the agenda for today. Is there any more discussion that anybody wants? Issues? Okay, if not, I guess we'll conclude for this week and carry on a couple weeks from now. Thanks everyone for your for attending and for your input. Talk to you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.